The ground beneath you is not original. It has been erased and rewritten so many times that almost nothing survives. And that is exactly the problem. Not because the evidence was destroyed on purpose, because the planet itself keeps eating its own past. In 2018, two scientists asked a question NASA funded. Could an industrial civilization have existed on Earth millions of years before us, and would anything be left to prove it? The paper is still cited. Almost nobody outside the field has ever read it. Here's what makes it worse. The layer humans are leaving in the rock right now measures 1 centimeter. 99.9% of every species that ever lived vanished without a single fossil. Earth recycles its entire outer crust every 200 million years. Tonight, we open 3 doors. One leads to a cave in Siberia called Denisova, where a single finger bone rewrote what human means. One leads to Jezero crater on Mars, where a river carried water for 1 million years before it simply stopped. And the last leads to a number so small that it might explain why nobody, anywhere, has ever found what came before us. By the end of tonight, you'll know exactly what that number is. If this is the kind of night you return to, subscribe. It helps this quiet universe keep growing. Let's begin. There is a boundary in the rock dated to roughly 56 million years ago, where scientists agree on one specific detail. Whatever happened, happened fast, and it happened everywhere at once, not a local event. A signature visible in ocean floor cores off Antarctica, in cliffs across Wyoming, in the seabed beneath the North Sea. The same chemical spike all over the planet, at the same depth. Geologists call it the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a sudden release of carbon into the atmosphere, warming the entire Earth by several degrees in a span that, measured against 56 million years, looks almost instantaneous. Here's what almost nobody outside the field mentions. Nobody has fully settled what caused it. Volcanic activity is the leading candidate, but when two scientists sat down in 2018 to model what an industrial civilization would actually leave behind in the rock, this exact event became their test case, because a burst of ancient carbon, released fast enough, produces a chemical fingerprint that looks almost identical to the one humanity is producing right now. Not proof of anything, a boundary condition. Here is what it would look like if it happened. And the honest answer, once they ran the numbers, was smaller than anyone expected walking in. A thin band of unusual sediment, a shift in carbon isotopes any first-year geology student could measure, if they knew to look for it. At that exact depth, in that exact core, everything else about that 56 million-year-old event, whatever built it, whatever burned it, whatever it felt like to live through it, is gone. Only the chemistry survived the trip. Hold that number for a second. 56 million years. And what's left could fit in a layer thinner than a page in this book. Now flip the question forward instead of back. Geologists who study our own era have started cataloguing what they call technofossils, the objects most likely to still be identifiable in the rock tens of millions of years from now. Not smartphones, not skyscrapers. The current leading candidate is disturbingly small. The bones of a single species of chicken, bred by the billions since the 1950s, so numerous and so chemically distinct from any wild bird that they may outlast concrete. A chicken bone, that's the anchor. Everything you have ever built, ever lived inside, ever called permanent. The tower down the street, the road under your feet, compresses, over enough time, into something with less staying power than the leftovers of dinner, which means the real question was never, would we find a lost civilization? It was, what does 56 million years do to anything, no matter how large it once believed itself to be? Steel doesn't survive that kind of time, and bone barely does either. Whole cities settle, eventually, into nothing more than chemistry. But the Paleocene-Eocene boundary isn't the only place this exact question gets tested. There's a stranger case, far more recent, far better documented, and it isn't buried in ancient rock at all. It's buried in a single bone, found in a cave that very nearly wasn't found. Here's a number that surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time. Across every extinct human species ever identified, every Neanderthal, every Homo erectus, every branch of our own family tree that no longer exists, the entire global fossil record fits into a space smaller than a few moving trucks. Some researchers estimate the whole collection, worldwide, represents only a few thousand individuals, pulled from a population that lived and died across 6 million years. Not because those species were small or short-lived. Homo erectus alone survived for close to 2 million years, roughly 20 times longer than Homo sapiens has existed so far, spreading across 3 continents as it went. And what physical trace is left of nearly all of them? Silence, not absence of existence, absence of luck. Consider what happened in 2013 inside a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star. Cavers found a chamber holding the remains of at least 15 individuals of a species nobody had ever catalogued, later named Homo naledi, reachable only through a vertical chute so narrow that the recovery team had to recruit scientists who were also trained climbers, thin enough to fit through a gap barely 7 inches wide, one accidental crack in solid rock. Without that one specific geological accident, an entire species might still be sitting in the dark, unnamed, the same as almost everything else that has ever walked upright on this planet and left nothing behind to prove it. Somewhere in your own family tree, the same math has already played out. More than once, every one of your ancestors, stretching back far enough, passed through a population small enough, fragile enough, unlucky enough that it could have ended completely, taking the whole branch with it. The only reason you exist to hear this sentence is that, generation after generation, across hundreds of thousands of years, none of them did. Bone needs specific conditions to survive that long. Fast burial, the right chemistry, no scavengers, no water table shifting through for 100,000 years. Most bodies, across most of human evolutionary history, had none of that. They decomposed the way anything does. The forest took them back and kept no record of the transaction, which means the fossil record was never a record of who existed. It's a record of who got lucky. And in October of 2010, that luck ran out in a way nobody was prepared for. Not because a skeleton turned up, but because of the opposite. A fragment barely the size of a fingernail, pulled from a cave in southern Siberia years earlier, sat catalogued and unremarkable in a drawer until a research team decided, almost as an afterthought, to sequence whatever DNA might still be left inside it. Not a full skeleton, not even a full bone. Here's the part that changes everything. What came out of that fragment wasn't a Neanderthal, and it wasn't us. It belonged to something else entirely. A population no one had a name for yet, known to science today only by the name of the cave it came from. The cave is called Denisova, tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, and archaeologists had been digging there since the 1970s without knowing what they were sitting on top of. The fragment in question, officially catalogued as Denisova 3, was a single finger bone from a juvenile, so nondescript that early researchers assumed it belonged to a modern human and moved on to more promising material nearby. It took a genetics lab led by Svante Pääbo, working in Leipzig, to actually test it. Ancient DNA this old is usually too degraded to sequence at all. Most samples fall apart into unreadable fragments long before extraction finishes. This one didn't. In 2010, the results came back describing a population that matched neither the Neanderthal genome nor the modern human one. Scientists had no ceremony ready for that. They named the new group after the cave, because there was nothing else to call them by. Here's the piece that took years longer to surface, and it's stranger than the discovery itself. When researchers compared Denisovan DNA against the genomes of people alive today, they found it still there, small percentages of it, lingering in the genes of populations across Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia. The Denisovans didn't just exist. They met us. They had children with us. And some of those genes are still doing work inside living bodies right now, filtered down across more than 50,000 years. So the fossil record was wrong, in the most human way possible. Wrong not because the evidence lied, but because it was never the only ledger being kept. Somewhere in you, or in someone you have stood beside, an extinct species may still be quietly present. This isn't only a Siberian story, either. A separate genetic study published in 2020, looking at modern populations across West Africa, found the same kind of signal. DNA patterns that don't match Neanderthals, don't match Denisovans, and don't match any fossil ever catalogued on that continent. Whoever it came from interbred with the ancestors of people living in West Africa today, then vanished so completely that not one bone, not one tooth, not one confirmed fragment has ever been recovered. Scientists gave it a placeholder name, and it isn't a metaphor, it's a technical term, a ghost lineage, because unknown ancestor with zero physical evidence didn't fit cleanly into any category that already existed. Pause on that. But the Denisovan genome held one more detail scientists did not expect, and it's the one that reopens everything this segment just closed. Buried inside their own DNA was a trace of yet another population, older, deeper, genetically distinct from every hominin species anyone has ever recovered a single bone of. Something interbred with the Denisovans. Long before the Denisovans met us, nobody has ever recovered its skeleton. Nobody has ever recovered so much as a tooth. The only proof it existed at all is an echo, inherited by a species that is itself known from one finger. Everything so far has been about disappearance. A planet that keeps eating its own history, compressing hundreds of millions of years into a few unreliable centimeters of rock. Earth does this because of plate tectonics. The entire crust, in slow, constant motion, diving back into the mantle at the edges of continents, and rising again somewhere else as something new. That recycling is the reason almost nothing on Earth's surface is older than about 4 billion years, even though the planet itself formed closer to 4.5. Mars never developed that system. Its crust locked into place early and simply stayed there, with nothing to drag the old terrain back down to be melted and reborn the way Earth's constantly is. Large stretches of the Martian surface have been sitting untouched since roughly the same era when Earth's own crust was just beginning to stabilize. Terrain old enough to remember conditions Earth destroyed the evidence of billions of years ago. Not because Mars was more hospitable, because Mars simply stopped changing. If you've ever wondered why Mars looks frozen in time next to Earth's constantly shifting face, this is the actual mechanism behind it. Not myth, not coincidence. One planet kept recycling itself. One simply stopped. Here's what that actually costs Earth. Almost every rock geologist's study to reconstruct this planet's earliest chapter has to come from a tiny handful of surviving outcrops. A strip of exposed bedrock in northern Canada, the Nouveau-Jitouk Greenstone Belt, is one of the only places on the entire planet old enough to remember conditions from close to 4 billion years ago. And even that rock has been folded, cooked, and crushed by billions of years of tectonic pressure. So reading it is closer to reading a message that went through a shredder and got taped back together by hand. Somewhere on Mars, in a crater a rover has now driven directly across, that same span of time sat completely undisturbed. No plate ever dragged it under. No ocean ever ground it down and reassembled it somewhere else. You are watching the slow excavation of a chapter that, on Earth, doesn't have a single surviving page left to compare it to. And inside that frozen window of time sits something that shouldn't belong on a planet as dry and dead as Mars looks today. the unmistakable shape of a river delta, fanned out across the floor of a crater, sediment laid down the same way water lays down, sediment anywhere it slows down. Scientists had been staring at satellite images of that fan shape since the 1970s, arguing for decades over whether it was really water or just wind-carved rock pretending to be. The argument didn't end with a better photograph. It ended when a spacecraft the size of a small car landed directly inside it, carrying instruments built to answer the one question no orbiter could. If a river really ran here, what, if anything, did it leave behind? On February 18th, 2021, a rover called Perseverance touched down inside Jezero crater, aimed directly at that ancient river fan. Its job wasn't only to look, it carried a full geochemistry lab, shrunk down to fit on a robotic arm, built to test Martian rock in ways no telescope, however powerful, could manage from millions of miles away. For 3 years, most of what it found matched the story everyone already expected. A lake, a delta. Sediment laid down the ordinary way, sediment gets laid down by water anywhere. Confirming, interesting. Not, on its own, enough to change anything. Imagine having the only rover for 100 million miles in every direction, and still needing 3 patient years before the ground gave you something worth pausing over. Then in July of 2024, drilling into a rock the mission team had nicknamed Chayava Falls, Perseverance's instruments picked up something that made the science team pause before releasing the data. Scattered across the rock's surface were small, dark spots ringed in a lighter mineral halo, a pattern the team started calling leopard spots, sitting inside a rock rich in organic carbon, containing minerals that, on Earth, almost always form through chemical reactions involving microbial life. Almost always. Not only, inside Mission Control, the reaction wasn't celebration. It was silence, followed by the kind of careful excitement planetary scientists have learned to hold at arm's length after decades of false alarms. Magnetic readings, methane spikes, shapes in the dust that all turned out, on closer inspection, to have ordinary explanations. Nobody on that team wanted to be the group that announced life on Mars and had to quietly walk it back a year later. NASA was careful, publicly and repeatedly, to call this a potential biosignature. Not evidence of life, not proof of anything, a pattern that fits what life would leave behind, but that non-biological chemistry can, under rare and specific conditions, also produce on its own. Here's what most coverage of the story didn't emphasize enough. The only way to know which explanation is correct is to get that exact rock back to a laboratory on Earth. That rock is already packed, sealed in a titanium tube, left behind in a cache on the Martian surface, waiting on a retrieval mission that, as of tonight, isn't expected to bring it home before the early 2030 seconds. If that timeline holds, the actual answer, not a headline, not a maybe, an answer read out of a real laboratory on Earth, could arrive within the decade. Some of you listening to this right now, tonight, are likely to still be around the day humanity finally learns whether that rock is holding a fossil or something that only looks like one. The most interesting rock anyone has ever found on Mars is already sitting in the dust, sealed and labeled, its answer written inside it, waiting for humanity to build a ship capable of going back to read it. Now step back from Earth, back from Mars, and out to the scale where this same question stops being about rock and starts being about the entire galaxy. In 1950, a physicist named Enrico Fermi was having lunch with colleagues when he interrupted a casual conversation about aliens with a single question that still doesn't have a clean answer. If the universe is so vast and so old, then where is everybody? For decades, the standard response leaned on distance. Space is big, civilizations are rare, of course we haven't run into anyone. But distance was never the part of the problem that actually held up. Here's what those numbers don't tell you. The Milky Way alone is roughly 13 billion years old. Complex chemistry capable of building anything resembling life has existed within it for most of that span. If even one civilization, anywhere in that history, developed the ability to spread, not warp drive spread, just slow, patient, machine-driven expansion at a small fraction of the speed of light. The math says it would take a few tens of millions of years to reach every corner of the galaxy. A few tens of millions against a backdrop of 13 billion. That is not a close call. That is a rounding error. So the silence was never really about space. It was about time. Which brings back the number promised at the start of tonight. Radio technology, the first tool capable of announcing our presence to the rest of the galaxy at all, is roughly 100 years old. Earth itself is 4.5 billion years old. Divide one by the other, and the fraction of Earth's entire history during which it has been detectable to anyone listening comes out to approximately 0.000000002%. Hold that number for a moment. Physicists have a name for whatever mechanism keeps a 13 billion year old galaxy this quiet. The Great Filter. Some barrier, somewhere along the road from raw chemistry to a civilization capable of reaching across the stars, that almost nothing manages to get past. And the deeply uncomfortable part of that idea is that nobody can tell you which side of it we're standing on. If the filter sits behind us, if the leap from simple chemistry to the first living cell, or from a single cell to a complex one, turns out to be the nearly impossible step, then we are the rare exception. And everything covered so far tonight, every near miss and every accident of luck, was Earth clearing a hurdle that stops almost everyone else. That would explain the silence without needing another word. But if the filter is still ahead of us, still waiting somewhere further down the road, then none of it was the hard part. Not the fossils, and not the ghost lineage either. Not even the fragile chain of luck that got you here. Tonight, to listen to any of this. You are living inside a species that has not yet found out whether it's going to pass. If another civilization, anywhere in this galaxy's 13 billion year history, had a detectable window as brief as ours, and it opened at any point even a few million years before or after now, we would have already missed each other completely. Not because either side did anything wrong, but because both flashlights were pointed in the right direction at the wrong moment. Walk to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, past a mile of exposed rock stacked in visible layers like the pages of an open book, and at one specific boundary near the bottom, something happens that shouldn't be possible if the record were complete. Rock from roughly 520 million years ago sits directly on top of much older rock, over 1 billion years older still, with nothing readable in between. No slow transition, no gradual boundary, just one clean, sharp line where hundreds of millions of years, in places over 1 billion, are simply gone. Geologists call it the Great Unconformity. And it isn't unique to one particular canyon carved into the American Southwest. The same suspicious gap, missing roughly the same enormous stretch of time, shows up in rock formations across nearly every continent on Earth, which is what makes it so strange. A local gap could mean a river carved through the wrong layer at the wrong moment. A gap on this scale, worldwide, clustering around the same window of missing time, suggests something erased the record at a planetary level, more or less all at once. For over a century, geologists disagreed about what could do that. The leading explanation, confirmed by a 2019 study using mineral dating techniques precise enough to trace exactly when this rock was scraped away, points to something almost too extreme to picture from where you're lying right now. Entire continents, planed down by kilometers of grinding ice, during a period when Earth itself had almost nothing left that resembled the planet you know. Some estimates place the missing material at 3 to 5 kilometers of solid rock, scraped off the top of entire continents and carried away, grain by grain, into the sea. Stand at that boundary in the canyon, and you could rest one hand on rock from 520 million years ago, and the other on rock from close to 2 billion. 2 hands a few inches apart, separated by more time than complex life has existed on this planet. Not every geologist agrees. The ice explains all of it. A competing line of evidence points to the breakup of an ancient supercontinent called Rodinia around the same window, which would have exposed enormous new stretches of continental interior to ordinary weathering, no glaciation required. The honest position in the field right now is that both mechanisms probably contributed, layered on top of each other across tens of millions of years, and untangling exactly how much erosion belongs to each cause remains one of the open arguments nobody has fully settled. What caused it wasn't a harsh winter, and it wasn't an ice age, in any sense the word usually carries. The reality underneath that missing rock is closer to something this planet has only ever done to itself twice in its entire 4.5 billion year history. And what that actually looked like from the surface is stranger than the missing rock itself. Somewhere between roughly 700 and 600 million years ago, long before anything with a spine, a shell, or an eye existed to witness it. Ice didn't just cover the poles the way it does today. By the best current reconstructions, it advanced past the mid-latitudes, past the equator, until the entire planet, ocean and continent alike, was locked under ice that in places measured more than a kilometer thick. Scientists call the leading version of this idea snowball Earth. And it isn't a single event. Try picturing it for a moment. Every ocean you've ever seen a photograph of, frozen solid, under a ceiling of ice thick enough to blot out any hint of open water from orbit. The evidence suggests the planet did this at least twice, each freeze lasting for millions of years before it broke. Here's the detail that took decades to work out, and it's stranger than the freeze itself. Nothing about a runaway ice age like that should ever end on its own. White ice reflects sunlight, which cools the planet further, which grows more ice, which reflects more sunlight. A feedback loop with no obvious exit. The mechanism that eventually broke it wasn't warmth arriving from outside. It was carbon dioxide, quietly building up underneath the ice for millions of years, pumped out by volcanoes that never stopped erupting just because the surface above them had frozen over. Eventually, the buildup won. The ice broke in what geologists describe as one of the fastest climate reversals in the planet's entire history, and the ocean that emerged from underneath it was almost unrecognizably different from the one that had frozen over. Rich in nutrients that had been trapped under the ice for millions of years, released all at once into water that hadn't seen open sky in longer than most species alive today have existed. For any complex life caught on the surface, a freeze like that should have been a full stop, not a pause. And for almost everything, it was. But researchers studying rock from this period have found evidence that life didn't vanish completely. It retreated into narrow refuges nobody fully agreed on until relatively recently. Thin cracks, where enough light still filtered through the ice to sustain simple photosynthesis, and hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, running on heat from the planet's interior instead of a sun that had, for all practical purposes, been switched off at the surface. Two different survival strategies, each one effectively betting the entire future of life on Earth on a margin thinner than most people would trust with anything. Neither had any way of knowing whether the ice above it would ever break. What happened next, in the geological blink that followed, is the part almost nobody expects. Within a relatively short span after the last snowball Earth ended, the fossil record explodes. Explodes into the sudden, rapid diversification of complex animal life known as the Cambrian explosion, the ancestral root of nearly every major animal body plan that exists on Earth today. Every hard shell, every eye, every basic body plan that shows up in the fossil record from that point onward traces back to whatever managed to survive in those cracks and vents, including, improbably, you. Not every catastrophe in Earth's past ended in a rebound. Roughly 252 million years ago, at the boundary between what geologists call the Permian and Triassic periods, something happened that makes every extinction event people usually talk about. including the one that ended the dinosaurs, look mild by comparison. Researchers estimate that somewhere around 96% of all marine species alive at the time were gone within a window that, by some estimates, may have lasted as little as 60,000 years. Barely a moment, measured against the planet's 4.5 billion year history. On land, the toll was almost as severe. Scientists who study this period gave it a name that doesn't bother softening the scale of it: the Great Dying. The trigger, as best reconstructed from rock exposed today in Siberia, was volcanic activity on a scale that has no equivalent in recorded human history. Eruptions that, over a few 100,000 years, buried an area roughly the size of Western Europe under lava, releasing enough carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere to acidify the oceans and push global temperatures up by what some estimates place at 10 degrees Celsius or more. To put the scale of that eruption in terms that fit inside a single thought, if it started today, centered where Siberia actually sits, the lava alone would bury an area from the Atlantic coast to well past the Ural Mountains, and it would keep erupting, without stopping, for longer than the whole of recorded human history combined. And the damage didn't end when the lava did. Ecosystems on Earth didn't return to anything resembling their old complexity for roughly 10 million years afterward. Long enough that if a civilization had existed and vanished before the Great Dying, this single event might have finished erasing whatever was left of it. Geology cleaning up after biology without knowing or caring that anything had been there at all. If you want a sense of how long that silence actually was, 10 million years is longer than the gap separating you, right now, from the first Homo erectus fossils discussed earlier tonight, repeated roughly 5 times over. Almost every lineage alive at that moment simply ran out of road. The 4% that didn't were not, in any obvious sense, the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones whose particular biology happened to tolerate the specific combination of heat, acid, and oxygen starvation that killed almost everything around them. You are only in a position to hear this sentence because, roughly 252 million years ago, one obscure branch of one obscure lineage happened to be built the right way, for reasons it never once had to understand. Paleontologists studying the recovery afterward found something else worth sitting with. The ecosystems that eventually replaced what was lost weren't simply the old world rebuilt. They were structured differently, dominated by different body plans, running on different rules, as if the planet, given a mostly blank slate, didn't rebuild the same story twice. Return, for a moment, to the central question this episode keeps quietly circling back to. Not what erased the deep past completely, but what almost didn't get erased at all. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists carefully digging in a limestone cave called Liang Bua found a skeleton that, at first glance, looked just like a child's. The skull was small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands. The full skeleton, once carefully assembled piece by piece, stood barely over 3 feet tall. It wasn't a child. Dental wear and bone density testing confirmed an adult, fully grown, built at a scale unlike any known human species. Researchers named it Homo floresiensis. The press, almost immediately, called it something else: the Hobbit. Not everyone accepted the new species explanation right away. For years afterward, a vocal minority of researchers argued the skeleton belonged to an ordinary modern human with a rare condition, a form of microcephaly, or a disorder called Laron syndrome, rather than a genuinely separate branch of the human family. It took over a decade of additional skeletal analysis, and the recovery of several more individuals showing the same unusual proportions, before the field settled firmly on a new species. The disagreement wasn't stubbornness, it was scientists doing what they're actually supposed to do, refusing to accept the stranger explanation until the ordinary one had been thoroughly, exhaustively ruled out. Here's the detail that took years to settle, and it's the one that matters most tonight. Early dating placed the most recent Floresiensis remains at around 12,000 years old. meaning, if the number held, modern humans and a completely different human species might have shared the same small island for tens of thousands of years. Later, more precise dating pushed that number back to closer to 50,000 years. Not because the earlier evidence was wrong about the species, because the specific layer that had been dated turned out to belong to a different part of the cave's long, complicated history than researchers first assumed. 50,000 years is still recent enough to overlap with modern humans moving through the same region, and it raises the same question the fossil record keeps refusing to answer cleanly. Island populations, by nature, leave behind smaller, more fragile trace evidence than continental ones. Fewer bodies, fewer burial sites, fewer chances for anything to fossilize at all. The Indonesian archipelago alone holds more than 17,000 of them, and you would be right to guess that almost none have ever been searched with the kind of scrutiny Liang Bua eventually received. Picture what that actually means for a moment. An entire, separate branch of the human story, small enough to miss, recent enough to have shared a horizon with people who looked like you, sitting undiscovered for over a century of active archaeology in the region, simply because nobody had yet dug in the one cave that happened to hold it. 1,300 miles north of Flores, on the Philippine island of Luzon, a cave called Calao held a second secret nobody outside a small circle of specialists saw coming. In 2019, researchers there announced a separate discovery, a third distinct human species, unrelated in any simple sense to the one found on Flores, identified from a handful of teeth and small bone fragments pulled from the cave floor. They named it Homo luzonensis. Like its Flores counterpart, it stood small. The fragments suggest a similarly reduced body size. And like Flores, its exact place on the human family tree is still being argued over, because the fossil sample is thin enough that reasonable scientists disagree on almost every detail beyond the fact that it existed. The entire physical evidence for this newly recognized species amounts to just 13 individual bones and teeth, all recovered from a single chamber over the course of patient excavations that began in 2007 and weren't confirmed as belonging to an entirely new species until 2019. 12 years of careful, unglamorous comparison before anyone was willing to put a new name on it. 12 years for 13 fragments, using modern genetic and imaging tools. In a cave researchers were actively excavating on purpose. You have almost certainly never heard either species named before tonight, and there is no serious reason within the field to assume these two are the last that will ever surface. Two isolated islands, two separate, previously unknown human species, both hiding in plain sight until a specific cave on a specific island happened to get excavated by the right team, using the right instruments at the right moment in the history of the field. Southeast Asia has thousands of islands that have never been searched with anything close to that level of scrutiny. Most have never been searched at all. Researchers studying the region now do so with a specific, stated expectation that Flores and Luzon are probably not unique cases, but the first two confirmed examples of a pattern that island geography seems to produce on its own. Isolation shrinks bodies. Isolation preserves lineages that would otherwise be absorbed or outcompeted on a larger landmass, and isolation, by definition, keeps evidence away from the researchers most likely to find it. Not a coincidence, in other words. A pattern one this entire episode keeps circling back to. Evidence doesn't announce itself. It waits patiently in the kind of place nobody has thought to look yet, for as long as it takes someone to finally look there. But Floresiensis and Luzonensis are not the strangest disappearance this part of the story has to offer. Neither one ever definitively met modern humans, as far as the evidence currently shows. Somewhere else, on a different continent entirely, a species that unquestionably did meet people who looked essentially like you, that lived alongside them for thousands of years, that had children with them, vanished anyway, and to this day Nobody has ever fully agreed on why, for roughly 5,000 years. Maybe longer, depending on which overlapping dates you trust. Neanderthals and modern humans shared the same stretch of Europe and the Near East. Not as strangers, glimpsed at a distance. Close enough, often enough, that today, if you carry any ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa, somewhere between 1 and 2% of your own genome is Neanderthal in origin, sitting quietly in your cells this exact moment, doing things. The immune-related fragments, the genes tied to skin and hair, that scientists are still working out. So the honest question was never simply, why did Neanderthals go extinct? It's whether extinct is even the right word for what happened. Researchers have spent decades arguing over the mechanism. Competition for the same resources is the oldest explanation. Modern humans, organized into larger, more interconnected social networks, may have simply outcompeted smaller, more isolated Neanderthal bands for the same shrinking supply of game and territory. A massive volcanic eruption from a supervolcano in what is now southern Italy, roughly 39,000 years ago, blanketed large stretches of the European continent in ash, right around the same window when Neanderthal populations were already crashing. A genuine correlation? Though correlation is as far as the evidence currently goes, here's the detail that reframes the entire question. A 2013 genetic study of Neanderthal remains from a cave in northern Spain called El Cidrón found something researchers hadn't expected. Clear signs of inbreeding, consistent with small, fragmented populations that had been shrinking and isolating from each other long before modern humans arrived in any significant numbers. Whatever finished the job, something had already been weakening the population from the inside for generations, long before the final chapter of their story is usually said to begin. None of these explanations rule the others out. A shrinking, inbred population is more vulnerable to a bad decade of ash-darkened skies. A population already struggling with volcanic winters competes worse for territory against organized new arrivals. Extinction, on the scale of an entire species, rarely comes down to one clean cause. It tends to arrive as several smaller failures stacking on top of each other across many separate generations until the combined weight finally becomes more than any single population is able to carry forward. And then there's the explanation that unsettles people the most, precisely because it isn't a tragedy in the way the others are. A growing number of researchers now argue that Neanderthals weren't wiped out so much as absorbed, folded gradually into a much larger, faster-growing population of modern humans through generation after generation of interbreeding, until there were simply too few individuals left who were Neanderthal, and nothing else for the distinction to keep meaning anything. Not a death, in the way most people picture extinction. A dissolving, the same word this episode already used once tonight, about a different vanished population entirely, and it will not be the last time it applies before tonight is over. On August 7th, 1996, President Bill Clinton stood in front of television cameras on the south lawn of the White House and read a statement about a rock. Not policy, not a crisis, a 4-pound meteorite, catalogued as ALH 84001, found sitting on the Antarctic ice in 1984 and later confirmed, through the trapped gases still locked inside it, to have originated on Mars, blasted off the planet by an ancient impact and drifting through space for millions of years before landing on Earth. NASA scientists studying the rock had found something that made their hands shake a little during the press briefing. Microscopic structures embedded in the meteorite that resembled, in miniature, the fossilized remains of bacteria. Chains of magnetite crystals, matching patterns produced on Earth almost exclusively by living organisms. Carbonate globules that, under certain interpretations, looked like they'd formed the way biological processes form them, not the way ordinary geology usually does. For a few months in 1996, life on Mars was not a tabloid headline. It was a sitting president reading a statement, live, on every major network. Then came the parts science is actually built for, and headlines almost never cover with the same enthusiasm. Other laboratories tried to replicate the findings, and structure by structure, the case fell apart. The magnetite chains, later research showed, could form through purely chemical processes. No bacteria required. The carbonate globules turned out to be consistent with heat generated by the very impact that blasted the rock off Mars in the first place. Geology mimicking biology by accident, not biology leaving a signature behind. Not a hoax, not bad science. Scientists doing precisely what the process demands, proposing the extraordinary claim in public, then watching the wider field take it apart piece by piece until only the parts that survived scrutiny were left standing. Almost none of them did. If you are old enough to remember 1996 at all, you may remember this moment more vividly than you'd expect. Magazine covers, breathless television specials, an entire summer where life on Mars briefly felt closer to settled fact than to the live, contested hypothesis it actually still was. That memory is itself useful data. It shows how fast a cautious, heavily hedged scientific finding can calcify into public certainty, long before the actual science has finished doing its work. The meteorite that once had the President of the United States announcing possible alien life sits today in a climate-controlled vault at a NASA facility in Houston, quietly reclassified, mostly forgotten by everyone outside the field. The leopard spots rock from Jezero crater is now walking that same gauntlet, decades later, with better instruments and a far more cautious rollout. And this time, unlike ALH 84001, the rock itself is still out there, unopened, waiting for a verdict nobody has been able to write yet. But ALH 84001 left the field with a question stranger than whether it once held life. If a rock can survive being blasted off one planet and landing intact on another, what else might survive that same one-way trip? Every meteorite that has ever landed on this planet is, in a sense, a message that arrived without any return address attached. Scientists have now positively identified more than 300 meteorites found on Earth as material blasted off the surface of Mars by ancient impacts, chemically fingerprinted by comparing trapped gas ratios against direct atmospheric readings taken by landers actually sitting on the Martian surface. The math confirms it beyond reasonable doubt. Sample after sample, pieces of another planet have been landing on this one. Repeatedly, quietly, for as long as anyone has had the instruments capable of checking. That fact alone raises a question serious astrobiologists have taken seriously for over a century, under a name that sounds more like science fiction than a real field of research: panspermia. The idea that life, or at least the chemical building blocks of life, might not need to originate on the same world where it's eventually found. That impacts powerful enough to blast rock into space might also be powerful enough, under the right conditions, to send hardy microorganisms along for the ride. It isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Certain terrestrial organisms called extremophiles are already known to survive conditions that would kill almost anything else. The near vacuum and radiation of low orbit, extreme cold, complete desiccation for years at a stretch. Space agencies have tested this directly. Samples of microbial life bolted to the outside of the International Space Station for over a year, exposed to the vacuum, the radiation, and the extreme temperature swings of raw space. An immeasurable fraction of them survived the trip intact, resuming normal growth once they were finally brought back down. The building blocks don't even need a planet of origin at all. In 1969, a meteorite fell over Murchison, Australia, and when chemists finally finished analysing it, they found something that startled even researchers who expected to find organic material: more than 70 different amino acids embedded in the rock, several of which don't naturally occur anywhere in Earth's biology. The chemistry of life, or at least its raw ingredients, had been drifting through space and falling onto this planet the entire time. Not delivered once, in some single dramatic origin event, but arriving quietly, repeatedly, for billions of years, mostly unnoticed. Here's what that actually implies. Once you let it sit for a moment, if Mars had a habitable window before Earth did, and the last several segments of tonight's episode have already laid out real evidence that it might have, and if a microorganism from that window could have hitched a ride on debris blasted loose by an impact, then the uncomfortable possibility isn't just that something existed on Mars before anything existed on Earth. It's that whatever eventually crawled, swam, grew fins, grew lungs, and eventually grew into you might have arrived from somewhere else first. A passenger on a rock, riding out a journey it never had to survive on purpose. Everything so far tonight has been about the past, about what already happened, already vanished, already left behind whatever thin trace of itself it was ever going to leave. Here's the part almost nobody expects. The search doesn't only point backward. 2 moons, both well within reach of current spacecraft, may be hiding something happening right now, tonight, while you listen to this. Europa, one of Jupiter's 4 largest moons, looks from a distance like a cracked, frozen marble, its surface a maze of reddish-brown fracture lines running across solid ice. The Galileo spacecraft, orbiting Jupiter through the late 1990s, picked up something the mission team didn't expect from a magnetic field reading. A signature consistent with a vast, salty ocean sealed beneath that ice shell, kept liquid not by sunlight, but by the constant gravitational flexing of Jupiter's enormous pull. Later estimates suggested that ocean alone may hold roughly twice the volume of water in every ocean on Earth combined, sealed under a shell of ice that in places may run tens of kilometers thick. A separate moon, much smaller, gave up its secret more directly. In 2005, the Cassini spacecraft, passing close to Saturn's small moon Enceladus, photographed something nobody had planned for. Geysers, erupting from cracks near the moon's south pole, spraying water vapor and ice crystals directly out into space, fed by an ocean sealed beneath its own icy shell. Cassini flew directly through the plume on later passes and found organic molecules inside it, along with molecular hydrogen, the kind of chemical signature that, on Earth, points toward hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. The same environment some researchers suspect gave rise to the very first life this planet ever produced. In 2023, a new analysis of that same plume data turned up something even more specific. Phosphorus, one of the essential building blocks of DNA and RNA in every living thing on Earth, present in concentrations higher than researchers had expected to find anywhere outside our own planet. Between the two of them, Europa and Enceladus give astrobiologists something Mars has never quite been able to offer. Liquid water existing right now, in the present tense, rather than water that existed billions of years ago and then vanished. Whatever chemistry is or isn't happening in that hidden darkness has had far longer to work with than a Martian window that may have lasted only a few 100 million years before it closed. None of this is proof. Every one of these signatures has a plausible non-biological explanation sitting right alongside the exciting one, the same way Shayava Falls and ALH 84001 both did. But for the first time in this entire episode, the open question tonight isn't only about something that already came and went, sometime in the deep, unrecoverable past. A spacecraft called Europa Clipper is already en route, launched in October of 2024, arriving specifically to study this question directly, meaning that whatever the honest answer turns out to be, it may arrive within your own lifetime, not some distant descendants. Not every mystery in this episode comes from a rock, a bone, or an ocean. On August 15th, 1977, a radio telescope in Ohio called Big Ear, built to scan the sky for exactly one thing: a narrowband radio signal too clean and too concentrated to have a natural origin, picked up a burst matching that description. Strong, sharp, concentrated in a slice of the radio spectrum close to a frequency scientists consider a likely channel for any deliberate interstellar transmission. The signal lasted 72 seconds. The exact length of time the slowly rotating telescope spent pointed at that patch of sky before it swept past. Astronomer Jerry Amon, reviewing the printout days later, circled the 6-character sequence representing its strength and wrote a single word in the margin, in red pen, that gave the event its name for the next 5 decades. Wow. DOPS. Here's what nobody managed to do afterward. Despite trying for decades, nobody ever detected it again. Not Big Ear, scanning the same coordinates repeatedly in the years that followed. Not any other telescope anywhere on Earth in all the years since. Researchers have proposed comets, since 2 were later found to have passed close to that patch of sky around the right general period. But the chemistry doesn't fully match, and the timing is closer to coincidence than confirmation. Nobody has ever produced an explanation broadly accepted across the field. In 2017, a researcher named Antonio Paris proposed a specific natural culprit. A pair of comets, unknown to astronomers at the time of the original detection, passing through that exact patch of sky and releasing a cloud of hydrogen gas dense enough to mimic the signal. For a while, headlines treated the mystery as effectively solved. Then other astronomers re-examined the claim, and the timing and chemistry didn't hold up as neatly as the original paper suggested. Comets don't reliably produce a signal that narrow, that clean, or that brief. The explanation collapsed under the same kind of scrutiny that eventually sank ALH 84001, and the file reopened. Consider what it actually took for Big Ear to catch that signal in the first place. The telescope wasn't actively watching in real time. It was sweeping the sky on a fixed mechanical schedule, recording data that a researcher would review by hand, days or weeks after the fact. If the source, whatever it was, had transmitted 1 minute earlier or later relative to that slow sweep, it would have missed the detector completely, and nobody would ever have known there was anything to look for. You are, in a very real sense, one small accident of timing away from this entire 72-second mystery never having existed for you to hear about at all. Not confirmed as artificial, not explained as natural either. Officially, to this day, it remains exactly what Jerry Emmons' handwriting called it, a single word, circled in red, that the entire field of radio astronomy still hasn't improved on. Planets passing in front of their star dim its light in a way astronomers have measured thousands of times over. A small, clean, predictable dip, rarely more than about 1%, gone as quickly as it appeared. In 2015, volunteers combing through data from the Kepler Space Telescope, working on a citizen science project called Planet Hunters, flagged a star that didn't follow the pattern at all. Catalogued as K8462852, and later nicknamed Boyajian's star after astronomer Tabitha Boyajian, who led the team investigating it, the star's light dimmed by irregular amounts at irregular intervals, sometimes barely noticeable, and on at least one recorded occasion by more than 20%. 20% is simply not what a planet does under any known configuration. An object large enough to block that much starlight would have to be larger than the star itself, which makes planet the wrong word entirely for whatever was passing in front of it. Astrophysicist Jason Wright, reviewing the data, raised a hypothesis publicly that most astronomers are usually careful never to say out loud in a serious paper. In principle, with an artificial structure. A partial swarm of solar collectors, sometimes called a Dyson swarm, built by an advanced civilization to capture energy directly from its star. He was careful to frame it exactly as what it was. The least likely explanation on a list of many, worth ruling out precisely because the data was strange enough to justify checking. Ruling it out took years of patient, unglamorous follow-up work, funded in part by public donations that let Boyajian's own team point additional telescopes at the star to gather the kind of precise, wavelength by wavelength data the original Kepler readings simply weren't built to capture. Here's the detail that settled it. Quietly, the way most real answers arrive compared to how the initial headlines had framed the question, the dimming turned out to affect blue light more than red light. A solid object, a wall, a swarm of machinery, anything opaque blocks every wavelength equally. Dust doesn't. Fine. Uneven clouds of debris scatter blue light more efficiently than red. Exactly the pattern the follow-up data showed. The leading explanation today is a shifting, uneven field of dust or debris, possibly the wreckage of a shattered moon or planetesimal, orbiting unusually close to the star. Not aliens, but not fully explained either. Nobody has yet identified precisely what produced that debris in the first place, or why it happens to be arranged in a pattern unlike anything else astronomers have catalogued. Among the hundreds of thousands of other stars, Kepler spent years quietly watching. The megastructure hypothesis is effectively closed. The star itself is still, honestly, a little strange. There's a broader lesson in how this particular mystery got resolved, and it applies to nearly everything you've heard about tonight, including, eventually, whatever you decide to believe about all of it once the lights are off. Nobody proved a negative by simply asserting it. Somebody built a testable prediction. Solid objects dim every color equally. Dust doesn't. Pointed better instruments at the problem and let the actual light do the arguing. That is the same method that closed the case on ALH 84001, the same method currently being applied to Shiava Falls, and the same method that will eventually settle whatever is or isn't happening under the ice of Europa. The process is slow. It is also, so far, the only one that has ever worked. Every search this episode has described so far. The WOW, signal, Boyajian star, decades of radio telescopes scanning for anything artificial, sounds from the outside like an exhaustive effort. It isn't close. Breakthrough. Listen. The largest and best-funded search for extraterrestrial signals ever assembled, backed by roughly $100 million in private funding, has spent years methodically working through a target list of the nearest 1 million stars, checking a wide but still limited slice of the radio spectrum for anything that doesn't look natural. 1 million stars sounds enormous, until you set it against the actual size of just this one galaxy, somewhere between 100 and 400 billion stars in the Milky Way alone. Even the most ambitious search project on Earth has only ever examined a fraction of a single % of the available candidates. And that's before accounting for the fact that any given star might only be broadcasting a detectable signal for a narrow window measured in decades or centuries, out of a lifespan measured in billions of years. Astronomers sometimes describe this mismatch using an old phrase borrowed from search theory. The problem isn't that the signal doesn't exist, it's that humanity has barely started looking, in a haystack this size, with a search radius this small, for a needle this specific. There's also the deeper problem of not knowing precisely where to point the search in the first place. Radio astronomers have long favored a specific stretch of the spectrum nicknamed the water hole, sitting between the natural emission frequencies of hydrogen and the hydroxyl radical, the two components of water itself. On the theory that any civilization familiar with basic chemistry might independently arrive at that same quiet, low-noise patch of sky as an obvious place to transmit and to listen. It's an elegant guess, built on real physics. It is still, unavoidably, only a guess. One assumption among many about how an intelligence entirely unlike our own might choose to say hello, if it ever chose to say anything at all. If you try to imagine finishing the job properly, surveying every star in the galaxy, across every plausible frequency, with instruments sensitive enough to catch something as brief as the WOW signal, the honest timeline runs well past any single human lifetime. Past the lifetime of the search program itself, past the lifetime of the institutions currently funding it. This is generational work. The slow kind. The kind where the people who eventually finish it were never realistically going to be the same people who started it decades earlier. And where, until then, the entire project runs on the plain assumption that finishing it will still be worth the wait. Which brings back a piece of tonight's very first number. Radio technology has existed on Earth for roughly a century. If any other civilization's own detectable window is similarly brief, then even a perfect, fully funded search of every star in the galaxy would only catch a signal if both windows happen to overlap. And Breakthrough Listen, for all its ambition, hasn't yet searched even a meaningful fraction of the stars where that overlap might be happening right now. Before this episode returns to the question it opened with, there's a piece of relevant evidence sitting far closer to home than either Mars or distant Enceladus. Proof that doesn't require a spacecraft at all, because it's already been sitting at the bottom of Earth's own oceans the entire time. In 1977, a submersible called Alvin, diving along a volcanic ridge in the Pacific near the Galapagos Islands, photographed something marine biologists had no framework ready for: entire ecosystems clustered around towering hydrothermal vents, more than a mile beneath the ocean surface, in water that never once sees a single photon of actual sunlight. Giant tube worms taller than a fully grown person, blind, ghost-pale shrimp, clams the size of dinner plates, thriving in complete darkness, at crushing pressure, next to plumes of water hot enough to melt lead on contact. None of it ran on photosynthesis. It couldn't, there was no light to capture. Instead, the base of that entire food web turned out to run on chemosynthesis, bacteria converting the chemical energy in hydrogen sulfide, spewing directly out of the vents from the planet's interior, into usable fuel for life. An entire ecosystem, independent of the sun, powered by chemistry the same way a battery is. Nothing about that ecosystem was fragile or marginal either. These communities turned out to be some of the densest concentrations of biomass found anywhere on Earth, thriving faster, in some cases, than comparable communities living in sunlit, shallow water, despite sitting in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. Extreme heat, extreme pressure, and complete darkness. And life didn't merely endure that combination the way a stubborn survivor endures a disaster. Life used it as fuel, the way any other ecosystem uses sunlight. If you have ever pictured alien life as something that necessarily needs a yellow sun overhead and a blue sky to survive under, the vent communities are the single clearest disproof available to you, and they didn't require a spacecraft, a telescope, or a single mile of travel beyond this planet to find. Here's why that discovery matters far beyond one ridge in the Pacific. Every argument this episode has made about Europa and Enceladus rests on this same mechanism. Chemical energy from a planet's interior substituting for sunlight in an ocean sealed away from the sky. Before 1977, that was theoretical, a convenient hypothesis with no proof behind it. Since 1977, it's been sitting in plain view, thriving, a mile beneath the same waves you've swum in without ever once seeing it, or even suspecting, until right now, that it was down there at all. Some researchers go further still, arguing that vents like these weren't just a curiosity discovered decades ago. They may be closer to where life on this planet actually began in the first place, long before there was a stable surface to speak of, and long before sunlight had anything at all left to shine down onto. Every question this episode has asked so far leans on the same quiet assumption, that if intelligent life was ever going to show up in this universe, 13.8 billion years ought to have been more than enough time for it to have happened already, probably more than once. A team of astrophysicists, led by Avi Loeb at Harvard, sat down and ran the actual numbers in 2016 and found something that flips that entire starting assumption on its head. The calculation starts with a simple fact about starlight. Not all stars burn out at the same rate. The sun, a fairly average star, has a total lifespan of roughly 10 billion years. Red dwarf stars, smaller, dimmer, and by far the most common type of star in the entire galaxy, can burn steadily for trillions of years, far longer than the current age of the universe itself. And because their habitable zones remain stable for that entire enormous stretch of time, red dwarfs will keep producing fresh opportunities for life to arise long after every sun-like star in the universe has already died. Run the math forward, weighting every star by how long it will plausibly support a habitable planet. And the result is almost the opposite of what most people assume walking in. Statistically, the era most likely to be dense with life isn't now. It's trillions of years from now, deep into a future so distant that most of the stars burning tonight will be long extinguished. By that measurement, judged against the full span of time this universe will likely exist. Life arriving at the 13.8 billion year mark isn't precisely late. It's closer to embarrassingly early. A party arriving before the venue has even finished being built. The same researchers estimated that, weighted across all of cosmic history, the odds of a terrestrial planet eventually forming around a star are roughly 1,000 times higher in that distant future than they are for a moment exactly like this one. You are not guaranteed to exist at any point in this universe's timeline. If anything, the honest odds favored something like you showing up far later than now, around a star that hasn't finished forming yet, orbiting a small, patient, red sun that will still be burning steadily long after every single star visible in tonight's sky has already gone completely dark. Hold that number for a moment, next to the one from earlier tonight. If that's roughly accurate, it reframes everything the Great Filter was trying to explain. The silence across the galaxy might not mean civilizations keep failing some impossible test, over and over, generation after generation. It might mean, more simply, that you are hearing this sentence during one of the very first windows in cosmic history, when hearing it was even possible at all, early enough that nobody else has shown up yet, isn't a mystery requiring an explanation. It's closer to what the underlying math already predicted, decades before anyone thought to run the numbers this particular way. Return, for the last time tonight, to the question this episode opened with. Not Denisova, not Jezero Crater, not the Great Filter, but the original one. If an industrial civilization truly existed and then vanished, what would actually be left of it, 56 million years later, for someone else to find? Tonight's answer has an uncomfortable second half that almost nobody involved has actually said out loud yet. Plainly, someone is already running that exact experiment in real time on this exact planet, and it's you, whether that thought is comforting or not. Geologists studying this current era of Earth's history have spent years debating a formal starting marker for what they call the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch. Distinct from the one the textbooks say we're still technically living in, defined by a layer of evidence humanity is actively laying down in the rock at this exact moment. The leading candidate for that marker isn't plastic, and it isn't concrete, even though both will likely persist for a very long time. It's radioactive isotopes from nuclear weapons testing, scattered across the entire planet in a thin, unmistakable band dating to the early 1950s. A chemical signature so globally uniform and so precisely dated that it may end up being the single cleanest time marker any species has ever accidentally left behind. In 2023, after years of deliberation, the working group of geologists responsible for defining this new epoch formally selected a specific physical location to anchor it. Crawford Lake, a small, unusually deep lake in Ontario, Canada, whose undisturbed sediment layers preserve an annual record clear enough to pinpoint the exact year that radioactive signature first appears. One lake, out of an entire planet, chosen to someday mark the moment humanity's fingerprint in the rock became undeniable to whoever eventually goes looking for it. Layer that on top of everything discussed earlier tonight. The technofossil chickens, the plastic sediments, the carbon spike that will look, to some future researcher, remarkably similar to the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum this episode opened with. None of it required a war, a headline, or a single dramatic event visible from orbit. It required exactly what the Silurian hypothesis described at the very start of tonight: a boundary condition, thin and easy to miss, legible only to someone who already knows precisely where and how to look for it. The paper that opened this entire episode wasn't only asking whether a hypothetical civilization from 56 million years ago would be detectable. In its own careful, understated way, it was asking the same question about the civilization writing the paper. Every discovery, every vanished population, every erased civilization this episode has walked through has been, in its own way, a rehearsal for a single, unavoidable question. 56 million years from now, if anything remains capable of reading rock the way this episode has spent the last 2 hours reading it, what conclusion, exactly, will it draw about you and everyone you have ever known? A telescope in Hawaii called Pan-STARRS caught a faint point of light moving through the solar system in October of 2017 on a trajectory no comet or asteroid had ever followed before. A hyperbolic path, meaning it wasn't orbiting the sun at all. It had arrived from outside the solar system entirely, swung past, and was already leaving, never to return. Astronomers named it Oumuamua, a Hawaiian word roughly meaning scout, or messenger reaching out from the distant past. Everything about it was strange enough to keep astronomers arguing for years. Its brightness fluctuated dramatically as it tumbled, suggesting an extreme, elongated shape. Some estimates put it at 10 times longer than it is wide, unlike any natural asteroid or comet ever directly observed. It showed no visible tail, no cloud of gas or dust. The telltale sign every comet leaves behind as sunlight boils material off its surface. And as it left the solar system, instruments detected something that shouldn't have been there at all. A small but measurable extra push of acceleration, the kind normally explained by a comet venting gas as it warms. Except this object showed no venting anyone could actually see. Most astronomers settled on a natural explanation. An unusually shaped fragment of a shattered comet or planetesimal, venting hydrogen too faint for the era's instruments to directly detect, the extra push explained by outgassing operating exactly as physics predicts, even without a visible tail. That remains the majority scientific position today. A minority, including Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb, the same researcher behind the "we might be early" calculation from earlier tonight, argued the data fit at least as well with something stranger. A thin, artificial structure, something closer to a solar sail than a rock, light enough that sunlight pressure alone could explain the acceleration. He was careful, publicly and repeatedly, to call it one hypothesis among several worth testing, not a conclusion. The object was already gone by the time the argument really caught fire, tumbling back out into interstellar space, too far away and too faint for any telescope on Earth to ever chase it down and check. 2 years later, a second interstellar visitor, Comet Borisov, passed through. This one clearly cometary, tail and all, resolving cleanly as the kind of object astronomers expected to eventually see. Oumuamua remains the outlier, the only one of its kind ever observed, gone before anyone could get a second, closer look. Its actual nature never fully settled either way. Consider what that timing actually meant for you. Specifically, objects like Oumuamua are now believed to pass through the solar system on a regular basis, simply too small and too dim for anything on Earth to notice most of the time. Pan-STARRS happened to be watching the right patch of sky, on the right night, with instruments only recently sensitive enough to catch something that faint. A few years earlier, and you would never have heard this story at all. One more silent visitor added to a list nobody on this planet was keeping. In 1961, an astronomer named Frank Drake, preparing for a small, informal conference at the Green Bank Observatory, wrote a single equation on a chalkboard meant to organize the conversation, not settle it. Multiply the rate of new star formation by the fraction of those stars with planets, by the number of planets per system capable of supporting life, by the fraction where life actually develops, by the fraction where it becomes intelligent, by the fraction that develops detectable technology, by the average length of time such a civilization keeps broadcasting. And the result is an estimate of how many communicating civilizations should exist in the galaxy right now. For most of the equation's history, nearly every term on that chalkboard was pure guesswork, stacked on more guesswork, that has, over the last 2 decades, stopped being true for the first few terms specifically. The Kepler Space Telescope alone confirmed that planets around other stars aren't rare exceptions but the ordinary rule. Current estimates suggest most stars in the galaxy host at least one planet, and a meaningful fraction of those sit in a zone where liquid water could exist on the surface. 3 terms that were once total speculation are now backed by real, measured data, refined year after year as better telescopes come online. The middle terms are still far murkier, and honest scientists say so. Nobody has measured the fraction of habitable planets where life actually gets started, because Earth remains the only confirmed example anyone has ever examined up close. Nobody has measured the fraction where life develops anything resembling intelligence. For the same reason, everything this episode has covered tonight, the Silurian boundary, the Denisovan bone, the leopard-spotted rock from Jezero crater, is, in a real sense, an attempt to move those exact terms from pure guesswork towards something closer to data, one stubborn fragment of evidence at a time. Here's what hasn't changed since 1961. Not by one meaningful inch. The final term, L, the average lifespan of a civilization capable of broadcasting its presence, remains a complete unknown, because humanity has exactly one confirmed data point to work from. Itself and its own track record covers barely a century. Every other term in Drake's equation has been getting more precise for 6 decades. This one hasn't moved, because moving it would require either finding a second example somewhere out there, or surviving long enough as a species to measure the number honestly from the inside. You, personally, happen to be alive during the only phase of this equation's 60-year history when every term is still, right now, being measured, argued over, revised. Whatever number future scientists eventually attach to human civilization's own value of L, nobody currently alive will ever get to read it. That number only finishes writing itself the day this particular experiment involving you, and everyone you will ever meet, finally ends, one way or another. In September of 2023, a team analyzing data from the James Webb Space Telescope announced something that traveled through science journalism faster than the researchers themselves could add the necessary caveats. A possible detection of dimethyl sulfide in the atmosphere of K218b, a planet roughly 8.5 times the mass of Earth, orbiting a small red star about 120 light-years away. The reason that particular molecule mattered enough to make headlines is specific. On Earth, dimethyl sulfide is produced almost exclusively by living organisms, primarily marine phytoplankton, with no significant non-biological source known to chemistry. Detecting it in another planet's atmosphere would be, at minimum, a genuine biosignature candidate. The strongest one telescopes had ever reported from outside the solar system. K218b itself belongs to a category of world that didn't even have an agreed-upon name until researchers, including the same team behind this detection, proposed one a few years earlier, a Hycean planet, short for hydrogen and ocean, describing a world potentially large enough to hold a thick hydrogen atmosphere over what might be a deep, planet-wide, liquid water ocean underneath. No planet in Earth's own solar system looks anything like it. If the category is real, and if worlds like it turn out to be common, An entire class of potentially habitable planet may have been sitting just outside the frame of every search this episode has already described, simply because nobody had a name for what to look for yet. The caveats arrived almost as quickly as the headlines. The detection sat right at the edge of the telescope's statistical confidence. Weak enough that other research teams, re-examining the same raw data within months, reported significantly lower confidence in the result. And some found the signal consistent with noise or with entirely different, non-biological molecules that happen to absorb light at similar wavelengths. As of tonight, the finding remains unconfirmed, neither retracted outright nor independently verified, sitting in the same purgatory that swallowed the Shayava Falls rock and, decades earlier, ALH 84001, K218b itself remains a live, ongoing target for further James Webb observation time, specifically because the stakes of getting the answer right are high enough to justify the wait. Nobody is rushing this one. Everyone remembers what rushing the last one cost the field's credibility. Nobody has ever actually seen the world at the center of this entire argument. Not with a naked eye, not with any telescope currently pointed at the sky. K218b has never been directly photographed. Every single claim about it. The hydrogen, the possible ocean, the disputed molecule, comes from analyzing how starlight changes color as it filters through the planet's atmosphere during a transit, a few minutes at a time, collected in fragments across dozens of separate observations, and stitched together afterward into something resembling a coherent picture. You are being asked, tonight, to hold an opinion about whether a distant planet might already be alive, based entirely on evidence you will never confirm with your own senses, gathered one flickering, indirect data point at a time. That is not a flaw in the process. It is the process, the exact same one that eventually closed the case on Boyajian's star, the exact same one currently working through the rock from Jezero crater, applied now to a target more than 100 light-years further away than anything else discussed tonight. Every biosignature discussed tonight. The leopard spots on Mars, the disputed molecule on K218b, was pulled out of indirect evidence. Chemistry inferred from starlight, never a direct photograph of the world in question. In 2021, the decadal survey that guides NASA's largest priorities for the following 10 years recommended building something specifically designed to close that gap. A large successor mission to both Hubble and James Webb, provisionally named the Habitable Worlds Observatory, engineered from the ground up to do something no existing telescope can currently manage. Block out the overwhelming glare of a distant star precisely enough to directly photograph the faint, Earth-sized planet hiding next to it. The target list, if the mission proceeds on anything close to its current timeline, includes somewhere on the order of 25 nearby sun-like stars, each one chosen specifically because it sits close enough and burns bright enough for the instrument to actually resolve a small, Earth-sized world orbiting steadily around it. Direct light from the planet itself. Not an inferred shadow passing across a star. Actual atmospheric analysis, with a level of confidence transit spectroscopy has never been able to offer. The engineering problem at the center of it is almost absurd once you hear the actual numbers. A star is typically 10 billion times brighter than the small, rocky planet orbiting it. The proposed solution involves a coronagraph, an internal mask capable of blocking that starlight with a precision measured in billionths, engineered to cancel out the star's glare so completely and so exactly that the planet's own faint, separate light finally has room to register at all. No space telescope ever built has required anything close to that level of precision, held steady, without error, for hours at a time. Current, still evolving projections place a possible launch sometime in the early to mid-2040s, assuming funding holds steady across multiple presidential administrations and the engineering challenges. several of which have genuinely no precedent in any telescope ever built before it, get solved roughly on schedule. That is not a small assumption. Flagship space telescopes routinely run years, sometimes over a decade, behind their original timelines. James Webb itself was originally proposed for a launch in the mid-2000s and didn't actually reach orbit until the very end of 2021. After repeated redesigns, budget overruns, and at least one well-documented point in its long history when Congress seriously debated cancelling the entire project outright before it ever reached the launch pad. If it launches roughly on schedule, and if it survives its own development, the way Webb eventually did after years of delay, there is a real, non-trivial chance that some of you listening to this right now will be alive to see the actual headline. Not a disputed molecule, not a hedge-filled press release, but a direct photograph of an actual Earth-like world, held steady in a telescope's field of view, and a real, carefully verified answer about what, if anything, is breathing in its atmosphere. Everything covered so far tonight has been building, piece by piece, toward a single honest admission. This episode has been circling since the very first sentence. The question of whether something existed before you, on this planet, on Mars, on some world circling a star not yet named, is not a question this generation of humans is going to fully close. Not the Silurian boundary, and not the ghost lineage buried in Denisovan DNA. The sealed rock still waiting in the dust of Jezero crater won't settle it either, and neither will the disputed molecule drifting in a distant, unreachable atmosphere, or the telescope still being carefully designed. Right now, to finally check any of it properly, this episode promised, at the very start of tonight, that you would understand exactly why the silence around this question might be the most important part of the answer. Here, finally, is that promise, paid back in full. The silence itself is not empty. It is an active record of every single method this episode has carefully walked through tonight. Still running, still checking, still refusing to mistake, simply wanting an answer for actually having earned one. This isn't a failure of tonight's research. And it isn't simply a gap waiting patiently on one clever new instrument to finally settle it for good. It's closer to the actual shape of the problem. 56 million years compresses almost anything into a few centimeters of ambiguous rock. 120 light years compresses an entire living or dead world into a flicker of chemistry and starlight. 13.8 billion years compresses the question of whether anyone else is out there into a haystack too large for any search humanity has built or is likely to finish building within a single lifetime. There's a second tension sitting underneath all of it, and it deserves to be named plainly instead of left implicit. On one side, everything this episode has covered points toward a universe genuinely indifferent to whether anything intelligent ever notices it. A universe that erases civilizations, freezes oceans, incinerates 96% of everything alive without pausing, and would do the exact same thing again tomorrow without a shred of malice or hesitation, because malice and hesitation both require someone paying attention. On the other side, the same universe produced exactly this, the specific, improbable chain of luck required to get a listening, wondering creature to this exact sentence. And whatever indifference the universe is capable of, it has not yet managed to prevent that. Both of those two things are true at exactly the same time, and they do not resolve into any single tidy feeling. This episode is not going to force them to. Tonight sits inside that tension rather than talking its way out of it. Indifference and belonging, occupying the same universe, the same night, the same few pounds of matter currently listening to this sentence in the dark. The ground beneath you was never original. It was always a palimpsest. Written over, scraped clean, written over again, by forces with no interest in leaving a legible record behind for whatever came next. Tonight will not resolve whether something intelligent came before you. It will not resolve whether something is out there right now, on Mars, on Europa, on a Hycean world with an ocean nobody has ever seen. This episode is not going to pretend otherwise, and it is not going to manufacture a tidy answer just to hand over an easy resolution. Some questions are worth sitting inside, unresolved, rather than closing early just for the comfort of closure. Go back for a moment and look at the shape of everything covered across the last 2 hours. Not the individual facts, but the pattern underneath them. A meteorite from Mars convinces a president, and then gets carefully walked back by better instruments. A star dims strangely, gets attributed to aliens as one hypothesis among several, and gets explained by ordinary dust once someone checks the color of the light carefully enough. A rock with leopard spots, a molecule in a distant atmosphere, a 72-second radio signal. Each one arrived wearing the same disguise, and each one got undressed by the same method. A specific, testable prediction, checked patiently against better data, refusing to accept the exciting answer until the boring one had been thoroughly ruled out first. That repetition wasn't padding, it was the actual argument, running steadily underneath every individual segment, waiting to be noticed all at once instead of one story at a time. The question was never really, did something exist before you? The real question, the one this entire episode has actually been answering all along, without saying so directly, is what does it take to know, honestly, either way? And the answer to that second question turns out to be the same every single time, on every single scale. Patience, a real prediction, and the willingness to be wrong in public. You have been given, across the last 2 hours, a working demonstration of that method applied to 9 or 10 different subjects, at scales ranging from a single finger bone to an entire galaxy. That is, itself, a kind of gift most documentaries never bother offering. Not just facts to remember, but a working tool for evaluating the next strange headline you happen to come across, long after tonight is over. Seen that way, tonight wasn't dozens of separate mysteries loosely tied together by a shared theme. It was one method, applied over and over, to Earth's oldest rock and to a planet's newest telescope. Because the method is the actual discovery, the only thing standing between we don't know and we never will. This is also, quite plainly, why the Silurian hypothesis opened the entire episode instead of arriving somewhere in the middle. It wasn't chosen because it was the strangest fact available. It was chosen because it is the cleanest possible statement of the method itself. A specific, falsifiable prediction about what evidence would look like, checked honestly against what 56 million years actually leaves behind. With no room left for wishful reading of the data. Every segment since has been the same experiment, run on a different subject, at a different scale. Mars instead of the Paleocene, a distant atmosphere instead of a cave in Siberia, a future telescope instead of a buried fingerbone. None of that guarantees an answer arrives on any particular schedule. It only guarantees that if an answer ever does arrive, it will be one worth trusting, earned the slow way, the same way every real answer in this episode was earned. Rather than simply the way somebody wanted the story to end, every single biosignature discussed tonight has treated oxygen, indirectly, as a benchmark. The kind of chemical imbalance in an atmosphere that shouldn't persist without something actively producing it. That assumption has a specific origin story, and it happened right here, roughly 2.4 billion years ago, in a slow-moving planetary transformation geologists now call the Great Oxidation Event. Before it, Earth's atmosphere held next to no free oxygen at all. The organisms that dominated the planet were anaerobic, built for a world without it, and to them, oxygen wasn't a life-giving gas. It was a toxin, a corrosive byproduct that damaged cells on contact. Then a new kind of microorganism, cyanobacteria, evolved a strange and novel trick. Photosynthesis, splitting water using sunlight and releasing oxygen as waste. For a long stretch, hundreds of millions of years. By most estimates, the ocean and various chemical sinks in the rock absorbed that waste product almost as fast as it was produced, keeping the atmosphere more or less unchanged, the build-up invisible to anything that might have been watching from a distance. Then, the sinks filled up. Oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere for the first time in the planet's history. And for the organisms that had ruled Earth up to that point, the result was catastrophic. One of the largest extinction events in the planet's entire history, caused not by an asteroid, not by volcanoes, but by the accumulated waste product of a single successful form of bacteria, slowly poisoning a world that had, until then, been built for something else entirely. Consider what that means for how confidently anyone should predict what a living world is supposed to look like. If you had been watching Earth from another star system before this event, the atmosphere you'd have measured would have looked nothing like the one wrapped around the planet today. No free oxygen, no ozone layer. None of the chemical signatures modern telescopes are specifically built to search for. A civilization searching for exactly the biosignature humanity currently looks for would have scanned this very planet at a different point in its own long history, and reasonably concluded, entirely wrongly, that nothing alive had ever called it home. Here's why that ancient catastrophe matters to everything discussed tonight. The free oxygen now sitting in Earth's atmosphere, the same oxygen every animal on this planet, including you, currently depends on to stay alive, is chemically unstable. It should react with rock and other gases and disappear within a few million years, unless something keeps actively replenishing it. Its mere continued, stubborn presence, detected from far enough away, would itself already count as a biosignature, the kind of atmospheric imbalance JWST is now hunting for around other stars entirely. The very breath filling your lungs right now is proof that a similar signal can be produced and can persist for billions of years, visible in principle to anyone patient enough and far enough away to notice it. A small experimental payload loaded onto a satellite called Photon-M3 by the European Space Agency and launched in September of 2007 carried something into low orbit that almost nobody expected to survive the trip. Thousands of carefully dehydrated tardigrades tucked among a wider set of biological experiments. Microscopic, 8-legged animals barely visible without a microscope, sometimes nicknamed water bears. For roughly 10 full days, that payload sat exposed directly to the raw conditions of open space. Hard vacuum, extreme swings in temperature, and cosmic radiation levels that would kill nearly every other known animal on the planet within a matter of minutes. When the capsule returned to Earth and researchers rehydrated the samples, a meaningful fraction of the tardigrades were not only alive, several of them went on to reproduce completely normally afterward, laying viable eggs that hatched into healthy offspring, as if the previous 10 days floating unprotected through space had barely registered as an inconvenience. Tardigrades survive this kind of exposure through an unusually effective biological trick. Under extreme stress, they expel nearly all the water from their bodies and enter a state called cryptobiosis, replacing that lost water with a specialized protective protein that keeps their cellular structure intact even when almost completely desiccated. Metabolism effectively grinds to a complete stop. The animal becomes, for all practical purposes, a durable, dormant, essentially inert package, until conditions improve and water becomes available again, at which point it simply resumes living, sometimes after years spent entirely in that suspended state. Combine that with everything else discussed about panspermia earlier tonight, and the implications stretch further than one resilient animal. If a creature built from ordinary Earth biology can already survive the vacuum and radiation of open space using a mechanism this simple, The bar for what a hardier, more specialized microorganism might endure during an accidental multi-million-year journey between planets starts to look considerably lower than intuition would ever have suggested walking into this episode. Tardigrades aren't some rare, exotic organism confined to a research lab either. They live essentially everywhere a person has ever set foot, noticed or not, in ordinary garden moss, in the sediment at the bottom of lakes, in the thin film of water clinging to roof gutters and the cracks of city sidewalks. An animal tough enough to survive open space has likely been living within a few feet of you for your entire life, going about its business at a scale too small to ever register. That combination is worth sitting with for a moment. A creature this ordinary, this unremarkable, this thoroughly ignored by almost everyone who has ever walked past one, still holds one of the best documented examples of extreme biological survival anywhere in the animal kingdom. It required no exotic evolution on some distant world to produce something durable enough to weather the vacuum of space. It only required this one, unremarkable animal, already here on Earth, already doing precisely that, for the entire span of time you've been alive, to not notice it happening around you. 56 million years ago, something left behind a thin, unusual band of sediment, and it took two scientists in 2018 to model what that band might mean. A different boundary, roughly 10 million years older still, was solved by that same method decades earlier. And it's worth understanding how, because it's the clearest real-world proof that the Silurian hypothesis' central idea actually works. For most of the 20th century, nobody had a solid explanation for why the fossil record shows dinosaurs thriving in abundance right up until a specific, sharp boundary in the rock, roughly 66 million years old, and then, abruptly, does not. In 1980, a physicist named Luis Alvarez and his geologist son Walter noticed something strange while studying that exact boundary in rock formations in Italy. A thin clay layer found at the same depth in rock samples from multiple continents, containing iridium at concentrations dozens of times higher than anywhere else nearby in the surrounding rock. Iridium is exceedingly rare in Earth's crust. It is considerably more common in asteroids. The Alvarez team proposed something that sounded, to much of the field at the time, like science fiction dressed up as geology. Powerful enough to vaporize rock and scatter iridium-rich debris across the entire planet in a single, thin, globally consistent layer. It took over a decade of skepticism and the eventual discovery of a buried impact crater roughly 120 miles across before the scientific consensus fully turned. The crater, named Chicxulub after a nearby town, dates to precisely the same 66 million year boundary as the iridium layer and the sudden disappearance of the dinosaurs from the fossil record. Case closed. After roughly 15 years of the same kind of patient, adversarial verification, this entire episode has described tonight. Here is why that resolved mystery matters more than a passing historical footnote. It is direct, physical proof that the central claim of tonight's opening segment isn't speculative. A single, catastrophic, planet-altering event really can leave behind nothing more than a thin, easily overlooked layer of unusual chemistry, indistinguishable from ordinary rock to anyone who doesn't already know precisely what to look for. Geologists walked past that layer for decades before anyone thought to test it properly. The evidence was never missing. Nobody had simply asked it the right question yet. If you ever find yourself standing somewhere with exposed sedimentary rock, a road cut, a canyon wall, a quarry, you are very likely standing within reach of a boundary just like this one, without any way of knowing it just by looking. The Chicxulub layer itself is thinner than a human finger. In most places it has been found, buried under 66 million years of accumulated rock above it, utterly unremarkable to the naked eye. It took a physicist willing to treat a geology problem like a physics problem, and a decade of people trying seriously to prove him wrong before anyone could tell you with confidence what that thin grey line actually meant. That is the model this entire episode has been built on, applied again and again at every scale it could reach. Not vague wonder about what might have happened, but a specific, checkable claim about what the evidence would look like, tested against rock, ice, starlight, and silence, until only the explanations that survived contact with better data were still standing. Everything discussed so far tonight involved evidence left behind by accident. A chemical spike nobody meant to create. A genome carrying a hitchhiker nobody chose to invite. A rock formed by processes with no intention behind them at all. In 1977, humanity did something categorically different. It built a message on purpose, aimed it at whoever or whatever might eventually find it, and launched it into interstellar space with no expectation of ever receiving a reply. The Voyager Golden Record, attached to both Voyager spacecraft before launch, is a gold-plated copper disc containing sounds and images selected by a committee led by astronomer Carl Sagan, deliberately built to explain human existence to an audience that might not share a single sense, a single language, or a single frame of reference with the people who made it. Greetings recorded in 55 different human languages. The sound of wind, rain, and thunder. Whale song, Bach, Beethoven, Chuck Berry, diagrams engraved directly onto the cover explaining, in a purely mathematical and physical language, how to build a player for the record and how to locate the sun relative to a set of nearby pulsars, each one ticking at a precisely known rate. Both Voyager spacecraft are now well outside the heliosphere, farther from Earth than any human-made object has ever traveled, still transmitting a faint signal back home on dwindling power that engineers expect will finally run out sometime around the late 2020 seconds. After that, both spacecraft will drift in silence, carrying their golden discs, for a span of time that makes every other number in this episode look almost modest by comparison. Estimates suggest the records themselves could remain physically intact for over 1 billion years, badly outlasting the civilization that launched them, quite possibly outlasting the species itself. Here's the detail worth sitting with this late into the episode. Humanity has now run both experiments tonight, has spent 2 hours examining at the same time without anyone framing it that way. It has left an accidental trace, the kind the Silurian hypothesis describes, layered into rock and ice and radioactive isotopes, and it has left a deliberate one, engineered on purpose, currently drifting through the dark, addressed to no one in particular and everyone who might ever find it. Nobody currently alive was around for the launch of Voyager, and almost certainly nobody currently alive will be around for whatever eventually happens to it 1 billion years from now. A span of time so far beyond any ordinary human timescale that comparing the two barely makes grammatical sense. And yet a small part of what makes you human, encoded onto that disc as a recording of human laughter and a mother's voice speaking gently to her own infant child, is already farther from Earth than anything else you have ever personally been connected to. Moving away from you permanently at roughly 38,000 miles an hour, and will keep moving long after every person who remembers launching it is gone. 2 hours ago, this episode opened with a single physicist's paper, and a question most people never think to ask, but whether it could ever tell the difference between empty and simply erased. Everything since then, the bone, the crater, the star, the signal, the record still drifting outward in the dark, has been one long, patient answer to that opening question, delivered the only way an honest answer can be delivered. Slowly, in pieces, with the gaps left visible instead of papered over. So, was something here before you? The rock says, probably not. Or, more precisely, the rock says it cannot rule it out, and has spent tonight explaining exactly why that distinction matters more than a yes or a no. 56 million years compresses even a global civilization into a few centimeters of ambiguous sediment. 120 light-years compresses an entire living or dead world into a disputed flicker in starlight, and the entire age of the dinosaurs, 66 million years of it, came down to a grey line thinner than a finger, missed by geologists for a full century before anyone finally thought to test it. 252 million years ago, a volcanic event large enough to erase 96% of everything alive on this planet still left something behind. Eventually, several extinctions and several near erasures later, listening to a voice describe it in the dark, a single finger bone, smaller than a coin, was enough to prove an entire vanished population had once walked, hunted, and raised children on this same ground. Every single layer this episode has patiently walked through tonight said some version of the exact same underlying thing in a different accent each time. Absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and the honest scientific answer, tonight and for the foreseeable future, is that humanity simply has not looked nearly long enough, carefully enough, or in nearly enough separate places yet to close this particular case either way. A civilization, in the end, is not a monument that waits patiently to be found, carved deep enough into stone to outlast every force actively working to erase it. It is closer to a signal, briefer than anyone standing inside it ever expects, broadcasting for a window measured in centuries against a backdrop measured in billions of years. Present, urgent, certain of its own importance while it lasts, and then, almost immediately afterward, indistinguishable from the silence that came before it and the silence that comes after. That was true of the Denisovans, known to science from one finger, and of whatever the Silurian hypothesis imagined, if anything ever answered its question. It is equally true of you, tonight, drifting towards sleep inside your own brief, urgent window. And still, this is the part worth carrying out of tonight. More than any single fact, the silence was never empty. It was never nothing. It was the sound of a universe patiently doing the one thing it has always done, over and over, at every scale this episode has visited, taking whatever exists, however briefly, and folding it back into everything that comes next. A frozen ocean became the raw material for the first complex animals. A mass extinction cleared the way for warm-blooded creatures no one could have predicted beforehand. An extinct species left its genes still running inside the bodies of the species that came after it, doing useful work 50,000 years later without asking permission. Folding back is not the same as disappearing. It never has been. On this planet, even once. The ground beneath you was never original. It was always a palimpsest, written and erased and written again, and there is no reason tonight, or ever, to expect your own layer to be the last one added to it. We've drifted through a lot of ground tonight, through 56 million years of missing rock, through a single finger bone in a Siberian cave, through a river delta on Mars that stopped running before anything on Earth had learned to stand upright. We've carried a ghost lineage buried in a stranger's genome. A species the size of a child sleeping undiscovered in a limestone cave for 100,000 years. A microscopic animal tough enough to survive the vacuum of open space without ever knowing it had done anything remarkable at all. We've wandered from the bottom of an ocean that never sees the sun to a telescope not yet built, past a thin grey line of rare metal that once ended the dinosaurs' entire reign, and out past the edge of the solar system to a golden record that is still moving, right now, farther away with every second this sentence takes to finish. None of it happened to you by accident, and not one single piece of it is truly separate from you either, no matter how distant or how ancient it first sounded when this episode introduced it. The same chemistry that built a hydrothermal vent teeming with life in total darkness built the cells now carrying you towards sleep. The same slow, patient carbon cycle that erased an ancient civilization's evidence, if one ever existed, is the reason there was ever a stable enough planet here for you to exist on at all. The same fragile chain of luck that let a single finger bone rewrite an entire family tree is the same chain that let every one of your own ancestors, stretching back through extinctions and ice ages and volcanic winters, make it to the next generation instead of simply ending somewhere along the way. Indifference and belonging were never really in competition tonight. They were always the same universe, examined from two different distances by the same species on the same night. If your eyes feel heavy, let them close. That was always where tonight was headed, not toward a verdict, but toward rest, carried there by the same slow current that has carried everything else this episode has described. The rock will still be silently arguing about the great unconformity tomorrow, the same way it has for over a full century now. The rover will still be sitting patiently in the dust of Jezero crater, unbothered, waiting on a ride home that hasn't even launched yet. None of it actually needs you awake to keep on happening. It genuinely never did. If this felt like the kind of place you belong, leave a comment when you wake up. Whenever that ends up being, tell this quiet universe where in the world you drifted off from tonight, and what you were thinking about in the last few minutes before it finally happened. And if you're still here, still listening, wide awake despite everything this episode has tried to do, the next chapter of this is already waiting for you whenever you're actually ready for it. There is no wrong answer to how tonight ends for you. Sleep is not the failure state of this channel, and staying awake a little longer isn't either. It was always the point, either way, that you were here for some part of it at all. On this particular night, out of every night this universe will ever have, whatever was or wasn't here before you, this quiet corner of it is yours now, for as long as you need it tonight. The universe will still be here when you wake up. So will we. Good night.